So in this part, as Pascal Caffin already said, we will be moving towards the main elements in taking the strategy forward, and I will be providing the long-term approach through food system resilience. Next slide, please. Could we go to the next slide?
Okay. I hope somebody is dealing with this in the room. Can you confirm?
Technical issues. There we go. Thank you very much. So just a few words about the Institute for European Environmental Policy. We're a sustainability think tank working with a range of different stakeholders and are committed to advancing impact-driven sustainability policy. Next slide, please. So in these next few minutes, I will be presenting conclusions from our report on food system resilience, and thereby saying what building blocks and what elements are essential to transforming the food system with a science-based approach. And this is really to take the opportunity for systemic change. The transformation is indeed a great challenge as it stretches from primary production over supply chain to consumption, and there are many actors involved. And this complexity is also part of the critique and hesitance to adapt. But changes in the food system are really essential as we face more shocks in the near future, and the Farm to Fork strategy has the potential to support this undertaking. Next slide, please. Now, in our report, we looked at the food system through the lens of resilience, and this concept has taken a more prominent spot in the policy theatre in the last couple of years, particularly during the pandemic. As we face recurring pandemics now and also a climate emergency, the food system needs to be able to withstand a variety of different shocks. Now, and in defining resilience and resilience building, here through policy, this signifies three main steps. Firstly, to reduce vulnerabilities, to anticipate future shocks, and also, lastly, to create an ability to absorb shocks. And this breakdown can help tackle the complexities of adapting the food system. Now, shocks often bring underlying vulnerabilities to the foreground, which are embedded in our unsustainable economic, ecological, and social practices. Therefore, considering resilience in policy requires us really to both analyse and be aware of the drivers of shocks and then act on these opportunities for policy changes. Next slide, please. Now, to summarise some conclusions from our report, I included here some of the different angles that are relevant for future shocks. Here we drew mostly on lessons learned from the pandemic. So, looking towards primary production, we had a look at the human nature into action. And here a main risk that was identified during the pandemic was the link between intensive and high-density livestock agriculture and emerging zoonotic diseases. That then have a negative impact on human population through increasing risks of shocks. Now, from a policy perspective, that means taking into account these vulnerabilities of primary livestock production and also integrating animal welfare, which allows for less intensive agriculture and thereby having the opportunity to lower the risks for disease. And this, for resilience building, means working on steps to provide greater stability in the face of disruptions. Now, disruptions is also a key word for the supply chain, where we saw in the last years a risk that is of great importance here to mention for disruptions in production and the transport sector, but also for workers as in a risk, in a certain shock, they have the risk that movement across borders is impeded, and the risk they also face in processing facilities when they work there. This is certainly supply chain considerations. Have to see that the system is very complex. There are complex interactions with trade relations inside and outside the EU. But here it is really important to look and assess the working conditions across the entire chain. So, as I said, workers' health and safety, as this is a basis for absorbing shocks. And to also take into consideration the options for short and local food supply chains, which can, in most parts, minimise certain risks. Next slide, please. The third dimension we looked at in the report was the consumption side, so focusing on sustainable diets and food availability. The risk during a shock is that members of society do not have access anymore to sustainable and nutritious foods. This was evident in the last years when school canteens closed, when there was an increase in the use of food banks, and then that through loss of income as well. So a nutritional deficit can result in being more prone to illnesses, which is then associated with increased public health costs. A policy message here to build resilience is that this must be anticipated, that an economic crisis can go hand in hand with the risk of nutritional crisis, and it is key to assess what food products serve both nutrition and sustainability purposes, such as protein crops, for example. Now, the Farm to Fork strategy here rightly points towards a push for availability and access to nutritious diets, so having sustainable food products as a default choice. This means creating the right food environment and also having a specific focus on children and women. This in turn creates resilience also against health conditions. So this is really looking at public health through food policies as well. Next slide, please. Now, taking a step to the policy actions, we've seen that in the last years has been more conversation about resilience, especially as the sudden threats of the pandemic hit. And the Farm to Fork strategy can be seen as a suitable tool to give these actions a framework and establishing the robust and resilient dimensions with the support of the following points. What is really needed from society and politics now is a deeper and wider engagement. There's a need for objectives to be driven by food chain actors, civil society, citizens and policymakers, especially at regional level. And this engagement should be enabled through the right policy framework. So one key element, it was mentioned before, is research and innovation. We see here Horizon Europe and also the Horizon Europe missions as key to connect fieldwork, trainings, monitoring with a societal focus. And this research can then raise people's interest in key sustainability topics such as soils and climate adaptation. And this engagement is then key to connecting these elements to advancing a resilient system. Now, coming back to one point that Mr. Caffin already mentioned, this is the other key strategic element for such a framework, which is governance of systemic change. And here, the policy development that stands out is the planned EU framework for sustainable food systems. A legislative framework can really assist the current strategies in properly tackling the systemic inconsistencies that hinder resilience building, and can also help to unravel the complexities. Now, drawing from our research, to have impact, the framework should include sustainability standards that are embedded in a legal framework. For the standards, the framework can play a role in 3 concrete areas. Firstly, to cover the entire food chain equally, to also have shared definitions of what makes a food system sustainable, and then thirdly, creating a guiding framework, meaning besides objectives and targets, to have robust and regular monitoring. For the legal framework, there are also 3 areas that are of importance. Firstly, that it is a binding legislation, as there are limitations to voluntary measures. Secondly, for EU funding to have clear rules and governance structures. And then thirdly, for the framework to support policy coherence across different sectors, because we've seen in this presentation and the others as well that the food system touches upon a range of policies, including environment, nutrition, but also social welfare and trade. Next slide. Now, to conclude with some final thoughts, this is a moment now to rethink and redirect policies to serve long-term sustainability goals. And it is a chance to make use of the Farm to Fork strategy to make resilience a central theme and working with the opportunities of the concept. So, as I said, addressing vulnerabilities, anticipating shocks, and the ability to absorb shocks. It is also important to have a governance framework which requires a high level of inclusion and scientific rigour at the same time. And then, lastly, in moving forward, to integrate stakeholder engagement that can strengthen the economic, ecological and social dimension of the food system. And the last slide. Thank you. Thank you very much.